So today I'm talking to Philip Su, who was a senior engineering leader at Microsoft, where he was for 12 years. And then he was also a director of engineering at Facebook, where he worked for 8 years. So what I want to zoom in on right away is your last day at Facebook. You actually bought coffee for every single full-time employee and contractor at the biggest offices in the company. And I just remember that so distinctly because it was such a huge deal in the company. Because I mean, even before that, you were a very senior leader. A lot of people respected what you wrote, including me, about how to navigate your career. And so I wanted to just ask you right away, what was the motivation behind buying coffee for pretty much the whole company?
Yeah, great question. And it was a wonderful experience. The motivation came actually a few Christmases before that. I had always worked in either the Seattle or the London offices of Facebook, but I would occasionally travel to its Menlo Park headquarters for business. And one year I was traveling to Menlo Park for business during the Christmas season. And so leading up to Christmas, on something like December 23rd, I had convinced the Phil's Coffee that's on the Menlo Park campus to basically make the entire day free for everybody, and that I would pay the tab for that as like a Christmas gift for everybody.
Yeah.
And that worked out really well. People really loved it. I loved the energy and seeing the happiness, like buying somebody a $3 or $4 thing is not that big of a deal. Well, buying one person a $3 or $4 thing is not that big of a deal. But just seeing people's happiness for a random stranger or doing an act of kindness for them that clearly comes with no strings attached, that was clearly not deserved or earned in any sort of real way, was just such a neat thing for me to experience. And after that day, I even had the leader of Phil's tweeted me, I think, saying that he was so excited that I had did such a thing. So that was like super cool that it generated this positive energy, I guess. I had always remembered that as a really motivating experience for me, and this sense of connection with the community of coworkers that can be built just by being kind. Right.
Yeah.
And so when I was planning to leave Facebook, I thought, well, I would love to do that, but just at a much larger scale. So I coordinated with maybe the largest 4 or 5 offices of Facebook to all on the same day make all their coffees free for everybody who comes by. And so that's the genesis of that idea, was actually a few Christmases before that.
Yeah. And I remember because I actually joined Facebook as an engineer late 2017. And I believe, just to put it in time, your badge post, your last day was Valentine's Day, I believe, of 2018. So we're talking less than 4 or 5 months after I joined. And I remember wow, this happened. How often does this kind of thing happen? Should I look forward to another few months, someone else buying me donuts or coffee? So I think it was super cool. How many coffees did you end up buying on that day?
Yeah, great question. I don't know the exact number, but I'll tell you the total bill internationally came out to essentially like a Tesla Model 3. Whatever that math tends out to, that's the number of coffees that I ended up buying.
That post blew up, right? It went kind of viral internally in Workplace, which is the internal version of Facebook that we all used. Like, what was your reaction, or what did you expect?
Yeah, great question. I think 2 main thoughts on that. One is I do think these acts of kindness are almost exclusively a pay it forward sort of system. I didn't expect anything back. I felt great doing it, and so it to me was an expression of thankfulness to my coworkers for giving me just an amazing experience at Facebook for over 8 years. So for me, it was mostly paying it that way as a sign of thanks to everybody. I will say the other thing that I found super interesting, which is just true for all of humanity as well, is that even though I bought thousands of people coffee, probably 12 people wrote me to thank me. For that. And so I am not saying that everybody else wasn't thankful. That's by far not the case. As you know, being a content creator, like every time someone has a thought, probably 100 people have to have a thought before one person writes the thought down back to you, right? And so I'm not at all saying that people are ungrateful, but all I mean is that you would be surprised at how few people actually do reach out personally to express a thanks. And so those people always struck me as very special in their own way, because giving people tend to be more giving with their praise as well. And so you tend to find the type of person that is in general more thankful and kind to others, being the type to also thank other people. So hearing from, 1 or 2 dozen people was just fabulous coming back from that. But I think overall, the whole thing is much more a pay it forward sort of system.
I think there's a hesitation around, okay, Philip, you've been at Facebook for 8 years. You're a big deal. You have a ton of respect. unless I have something meaningful to say in that message, do I have the right to kind of message him out of the blue saying thank you, or just waste his time? So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, like any advice to maybe overcome that.
Yeah, totally. And you're absolutely right. And like, just to reinforce your point as well, which I think is spot on, like, the experiences we have, like, we don't always get a chance to connect or talk about them, right? And I don't expect that we will in all cases. But I do think that this idea of people reaching out to make that connection, having a reason to connect, I think you're right, is like a key thing that stops people from doing it. What I've been doing recently, and I forgot which podcast I heard this on, but one behavioral change I've been trying to make in myself is nowadays when a positive message triggers in my mind, I force myself to like write and send it. Because a lot of positive messages in my mind, I actually think, and then I don't really act on them because, like you said, sometimes they don't feel kind of big enough or meaningful enough to actually reach out to someone to say. But if you think about it in your own life, how often in a week do you receive a message that is purely positive without any strings or expectations or any return back, right? Yeah. People will often say a nice thing when they need something from you, or they'll say a nice thing when they want to keep like a relationship alive. But you very rarely have like a completely no string sort of like, hey, that was a great presentation you gave, or like, hey, I really loved it when you sent this one message to me, like stuff like this, right? Yeah. So I've been trying to force myself to like try to overcome that internal inertia or that hesitancy to reach out when the message is positive. I think when the message is negative or critical, then like the natural sort of slowing down is actually good for me, of like thinking it over. But on the positive side, I'm trying to, I guess, reduce the activation energy it takes to trigger that.
What's interesting about this buying coffee for the whole company story is that it's actually, I think, emblematic of a pattern of what you had been doing at Facebook, which is that you were a really good writer and you talked about, your experience of your advice that you had shared as you, went through the ranks, and not just at Facebook, but also your time at Microsoft. And you shared that openly, not only like, okay, I'm killing the game, which I think a lot of people are happy to do, but I do also think that you did a really good job of talking about some of the struggles you had. And, you went to the management track, you came back to the IC track, and you shared some of the story, the good and bad parts of that. I'm curious, what was the motivation for doing that so consistently at your time at Facebook?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the very special things about Facebook that was very different from the Microsoft I had worked at for 12 years was when I first joined Facebook, and actually for many years at Facebook, prior to the workplace product being a product on its own, for many years, the expectation at Facebook was that you would be Facebook friends with all of your coworkers.
Yeah.
For me, coming from Microsoft, that at first felt very weird. It felt like some sort of violation of work-life balance. It felt like some sort of maybe privacy violation of some sort. But I quickly got not only very used to it, but I quickly came to see the benefit of it, which is when you see people posting about their dog or about their kids or about like something that's going well in their personal life, when you see that coworker as a whole person that way, it is much easier for that social trust and social capital to be built within. And so I felt that it smoothed out working relationships a whole lot to see your coworkers as whole people. And I would go further to say that once Workplace as a product was rolled out and a number of employees elected to not be Facebook friends with their coworkers, but instead just to be on Workplace, I think it lost some of that initial connection. So towards your question of like sharing openly within the company, part of my hope was to preserve that initial feeling of mutual trust. Like there are things that I would say within the company that I wouldn't say broadly or publicly, but I thought that by being open within, that it would, by me demonstrating an openness to others, that others would be open to me as well. And indeed, I had many people reach out to me privately about responses to their emotional responses to things that I wrote that were helpful to them. Like when I talk about, for instance, receiving a very bad performance review for myself, that was crushing for me. But for me to express that to other people gave them an opening where they could express to me how disappointed they were about their own reviews in a way that they never would have if I didn't open the door to that. Like you would never initiate a message with another person like, oh, I had a terrible review, blah, 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 unless they were a pretty close friend, right? And so I did find that, I think in a world where many of us can feel lonely and isolated, we find commonality by first exposing parts of ourselves that are vulnerable and being open with that, and finding that others, many others, share similar thoughts that we just don't know about.